perhaps hundreds of criminal cases in which the nation's top law enforcement agency has participated hang in the balance. And so, in some ways, a specter is haunting the justice system itself. But unlike all those long-ago warnings from J. Edgar Hoover, the specter this time is not communism or organized crime. It's the Bureau's own crime lab and the serious problems and inadequacies which afflict it. Next week, Attorney General Janet Reno is expected to approve and release the findings of an independent investigator, the Justice Department's Inspector General, who took a long, hard look at the FBI crime lab, and according to preliminary reports, he found it wanting. Dan Abrams begins our coverage of the crisis in the nation's biggest crime lab, a crisis that has some politicians looking for a fall guy.
Someone needs to police the police. They don't seem to be policing themselves very well.
For the fifth time, Senator Chuck Grassley took the floor and blasted the FBI. His target this time? The crime lab.
The issue of bad management in the crime lab is serious. Bad scientific analysis used in court means good guys can go to prison and bad guys can walk.
With the Inspector General's report on the lab about to be released, the issue seems not to be whether there are problems at the lab, but just how bad they are.
I felt confident that they were doing a good job.
Martin Weinstein is a former federal prosecutor who is now a defense attorney. He predicts the report will not show widespread problems.
It's my belief that to the extent that there were problems, that they are being corrected, but they are on a much more limited basis than Mr. Whitehurst's allegations.
FBI agent Frederick Whitehurst has been complaining about the lab for years. His charges are now threatening to hurt the government's case against Timothy McVeigh, charged in the Oklahoma City bombing. Whitehurst was suspended from the FBI in January, and 3 explosive experts were removed from their jobs without explanation, including the one in charge of handling the evidence at the bomb site. McVeigh's lawyer has called the lab a ticking time bomb.
The lab work, like the so-called identification of Mr. McVeigh in Junction City, is extremely critical to the government. If they lose on those 2 issues, they are rearranging deck chairs on the Titanic.
A draft of the Inspector General's final report was leaked to the Los Angeles Times. It suggests real problems with the Oklahoma City case. According to the paper, the Inspector General has determined that the FBI crime lab made scientifically unsound conclusions in the case, that supervisors approved lab reports that they cannot support, and that many analyses were biased in favor of the prosecution.
I'd be lying if I said any different. Ultimately, I don't regret it.
Those findings seem to echo charges Whitehurst made in another high-profile case.
What I would expect is damage control.
Roger Stavis represented one of the 12 defendants in the World Trade Center conspiracy trial. Whitehurst, who worked on the case, testified as a defense witness. He said he was pressured to change his findings about the type of explosive that may have caused the blast because it didn't fit the FBI theory of the case.
What this did, and the import of what happened in our trial, was it showed that the FBI lab was just being used as an arm of the prosecution.
But the Los Angeles Times claims the draft report casts some doubt on Whitehurst's credibility. It concludes that Whitehurst's numerous other contentions lack merit. FBI Director Louis Freeh insists that no prosecutions have been compromised by problems at the lab. But senior officials at the Justice Department have said that as many as 50 criminal cases around the country might be affected. Others say the number could be much larger.
All local district attorneys' offices rely upon the FBI laboratory for analysis in various forensic areas. So I think it's going to
use it as fodder for cross-examination.
Many courtroom lawyers are able to turn a lot of things that don't have a whole lot of substance to them into an awful lot of smoke and to create an awful lot of reasonable doubt.
When the integrity of the system is drawn into question, that's not smoke. when findings are changed to support a prosecution
on the walls of any courtroom.
Our criminal justice system sets us apart from many nations on earth. And it is the belief in that system and the grounding in that system and the people, the general public's belief that the system and their government deals with them fairly that is one of the great things about this country.
The stakes in this matter, then, are very high indeed, and we want to explore the crime lab's problems now, consider its future, too, with three men who bring different perspectives to the problem. In Washington, Martin Weinstein is with us. He was formerly an assistant U.S. attorney in Atlanta, is now in private practice in D.C. Marvin Allen is a top criminal defense attorney, a member of the board of directors of the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers. And David Colapinto is a lawyer who represents the man who started it all, the whistleblower, Frederick Whitehurst. Gentlemen, welcome. And
Thank
Mr.
you.
Allen,
It's Marvin Miller.
Marvin Miller.
That's quite all right.
Excuse me, and I'd like to begin with you, Mr. Miller, if I may. We've heard about the World Trade Center bombing case, the Oklahoma City bombing case. From your perch at the National Association of Criminal Defense Lawyers, how extensive are the ramifications of what we know so far, and we'll find out a great deal more next week, to be the problems in the crime lab at the FBI?
Well, they're very disconcerting, to say the least. The problems have been underway since about 1982. According to Judge GRASSLEY, in the suit that's pending in the District of Columbia to try and have the report released, they could affect as many as 1,000 or more cases. The most disconcerting thing about it is that the FBI is filing a report to try and put their spin on what they think they did wrong. And the real test is going to be when judges get the raw material and defense attorneys get the raw material to find out what happened. We are in a very interesting societal change these days where, as Senator Grassley said, Congress has given free rein to the prosecutor without looking over their shoulder. They sort of abdicated the balance of powers concept that the founders established in the Constitution. And I think that it's going to be a very far-ranging thing. They pulled out witnesses in the Oklahoma bombing case. They've had to re-examine the prosecution against Judge Alcee Hastings. They had to pull evidence in a white supremacy case involving Mr. Langan. And so I think that the ramifications are going to be far-ranging.
And perhaps not just in the cases in which the lab was involved, but in future cases. Martin Weinstein, as a prosecutor, you stood up in front of jurors quite a few times, my guess is, with the authority and the dignity and majesty of the federal government behind you. How much of a blow do you think this report and the ramifications that Mr. Miller say could flow from it will be to prosecutors in the future who stand before jurors?
When a prosecutor stands up and addresses a jury, he addresses a jury on behalf of the people of the United States, and so his credibility and the credibility of the country and those people that work with him is what a main source of his case is. If it turns out that the lab was involved in widespread malfeasance, that's going to hurt the prosecutor's credibility, and it's going to hurt every prosecutor's credibility nationwide. My belief is that this report is exactly the correct thing to be doing. The FBI and the Justice Department is doing exactly what a system with integrity does. Take a hard look at itself when there are allegations of wrongdoing. And this is exactly an appropriate report. It's been a thorough investigation. I believe the findings are going to be a step forward in terms of making the FBI lab a better place. It's been responsible for some great convictions, and it provides great evidence day in and day out in thousands of cases, and prosecutors rely on it. And if mistakes were made, then I think they're going to be corrected, and I think this report is a good first step.
An optimistic look at what's happening. And let me ask the man who's representing the source of many of the allegations, Mr. Colapinto. Your client, Frederick Whitehurst, began all this with his discussion of cronyism and problems in the lab. Do you think that the FBI is on the right track here?
I don't think the FBI is on the right track. I think they have a long way to go to clean up the problem. Dr. Whitehurst started raising these problems almost 10 years ago. We are now at a point where we are at the conclusion of an almost 2 to 3 year investigation by the Department of Justice Inspector General. And I think when the American people see the report that is issued next week by the IG, they will see that we have just begun to look at the problems in the laboratory. I think what that report is going to show is that there are systemic problems within the FBI crime lab that extend far beyond the area of explosives where Dr. Whitehurst worked. I think we're going to be looking at problems in the area of paint, in the area of hair and fibers, and metallurgy, just to name a few. And I think that the systemic problems, such as biasing reports in favor of prosecutors, which, from what we have read in the press, has already been confirmed and substantiated in a couple of instances, is going to substantiate a large number of Dr. Whitehurst's allegations that he raised internally beginning 10 years ago. You might want to ask yourself, why has it taken the FBI this long to address these problems, and now they still have not addressed the problems, and they are the subject of criticism by an external
Well, let
review.
me ask Martin Weinstein, as a former prosecutor, you'd send evidence to the FBI crime lab. What did you want coming back? Did you want a crime lab that was on your side?
This is the most interesting aspect of this whole discussion, is that what a prosecutor wants is evidence that comes back that's credible and is going to stand up under cross-examination. If the report is biased and the findings are so far-reaching and so far-fetched that they're not going to be substantiated before a jury, this is no friend to a prosecutor, and no prosecutor anywhere in the country on a state or federal level is going to want a report that can't stand up under cross-examination. What a prosecutor wants is a report that's fair, honest, credible, to put forth before the jury, and a report that is going to stand up not only during direct examination and cross-examination, but when the jury goes back into the jury room and deliberates between the guilt and innocence of a defendant.
That's one of the interesting things about this report, and that is that the shading of testimony to favor the prosecution so that they could get a stand-up report when the truth was that a stand-up report wasn't really available. And that's one of the most shocking things that the leaks so far have revealed. The prosecutors rely on these reports. The people who are preparing them are people who are trained in knowing what they need to get a conviction. And the shading of evidence, for example, in the Alcee Hastings case, an FBI lab technician testified that they had performed tests. That was a lie. They hadn't performed the test, someone else did. In addition to that, they concealed specific evidence that would have been helpful to the defense.
All right, they are, in fact, shocking charges. We're going to have to take a break right now. When we come back, we'll continue. One of the leading crime labs in the world, but it has recently been rocked by allegations of bias and incompetence within the crime lab itself. And next week, Attorney General Janet Reno is expected to release a report by an independent investigator, the Inspector General of the Justice Department, which will detail some serious problems at the crime lab, apparently. We're talking about that with several experts in the area, and I want to go to Marvin Miller on this question. Mr. Miller, a lot of people perhaps who watched the O.J. Simpson trial, saw the physical evidence in that case wearyingly worn away by Barry Scheck and others in cross-examination, nevertheless thought that the rest of the evidence may have been sufficient to sustain a conviction. Is this endless grist for cross-examination mills and perhaps an impediment to truly reaching justice in the system?
No, I think what this is a real grist for the mill of truth, and I think it's going to make the mill grind out some real truth. An interesting thing about the O.J. case, if you take, no offense to you all, but the media aside and look at the people who actually watched the entire trial itself, the evidence the jury saw, more than 80% of those people believe that the prosecutor did not prove their case. We are in a society now where there's a political onslaught, and I don't think the people are fully behind it, but there is a political onslaught to try and vilify anyone who is accused, and if you're accused, you're guilty. And the fairness seems to have been lost, and the balance seems to have been swinging in the wrong direction. And as Senator Grassley said in your intro, we need to bring back the balance. We need to have scrutiny. Prosecutors, as Mr. Weinstein will tell you, never lose a case, because as long as they present a fair and honest prosecution, whatever the verdict, justice has been done. And that's why people participate by being jurors. And we want honest lab reports that give honest results that aren't shaded or twisted in subtle little sophisticated ways to try and twist the truth in a way that's not really honest.
All right, Mr. Weinstein, I want to go to you on a question of how the crime lab works. My understanding is that a position at the crime lab is a plum position for people who don't necessarily have a lot of degrees and education in the science, but who've worked for the FBI elsewhere. Is that the best way to run a crime lab?
Well, I'm not sure that the assumption you make is an accurate one. I think what the crime lab is looking for clearly are those people that have abilities and disciplines in the areas that the crime lab functions. Oftentimes the people who are in the crime lab are people who are field agents who have spent some time out in the field prosecuting and being involved in the prosecution of cases, and what they do is they then go into the lab and gain additional skills to make them better lab technicians. I don't think that the FBI puts in the lab, and I never saw anybody who was put in the FBI lab who did not have the skills and the training to carry out their duties. I believe that when you take a combination of field experience with technical skills, you're going to have the best lab technicians. I don't candidly know the best way to select lab technicians, but I think the group of young people and older people and men and women and people of all shapes and sizes who work in the laboratory at the FBI and affiliated laboratories that work with the FBI, I think you've got a good group of people that want to do the right thing, that are for the most part separated from their cases by substantial geographic distance, and in this way are able to render what we believe is a relatively fair and independent opinion.
All right, David Colapinto, your client, a chemist coming into the crime lab, was it his perspective that the lab was staffed by people with the necessary expertise?
Absolutely not. I think what you're going to find in this report next week is a problem of people who are not properly trained and qualified, who go into the courts of law and pass themselves off as scientific experts, when the FBI had at their disposal PhD scientists who were not asked to go in and perform that testimony. What do we have going on here? It's time to put scientific integrity back into the FBI laboratory. We're not talking about strict law enforcement. We're talking about matters of science. And I think it is highly inappropriate for the FBI to manipulate scientific data in order to obtain a conviction. What that does is, Mr. Weinstein is exactly correct that the prosecutor has to rely on honest reports. What we're seeing here is the prosecutor being blindsided, the prosecutor not being told all the facts, and that results in acquittals, perhaps, where there shouldn't be acquittals. It also results in people who are innocent being sent to jail.
If I can follow up with your client, who's now been suspended from the crime lab himself. You've represented whistleblowers in the past. What's your feeling about that?
This is an unbelievable situation where the FBI has gone out and shot the messenger. They have overreacted. They have come down with a very heavy-handed prohibition on his ability to even communicate with other employees at the FBI, including his wife who works there. His wife was given a letter and said that she couldn't talk to her husband about matters related to FBI work. I think that this is absolutely atrocious for the FBI to do this sort of thing, and for the Justice Department to stand by and to let this happen, I think taints the entire IG process.
If they were interested in the truth, then I'm wondering why they would want to relieve him of his duty and prevent him from talking with other agents. I'm also curious if they're interested in the truth. When the court ordered that the report be made available to Mr. Whitehurst, the FBI sat there and said he could take no notes, he couldn't tell his lawyer. If they're interested in the truth, then why don't they just let out the truth? Why is it, I wonder, and I think the American people ought to wonder, that they're trying to do a controlled report so that when it comes to the public, it comes from them with their gloss. There have been many occasions when the Office of Professional Responsibility has investigated actions by federal prosecutors and given them a complete whitewash. Recently in South Carolina, State Senator Taylor's indictment was dismissed by a very conservative U.S. District Court judge who found that the Federal Bureau of Investigation agents and prosecutors had violated countless constitutional obligations imposed upon them, even though their own internal investigation exonerated them. And this conservative and thoughtful jurist said, we can't have that kind of conduct in this country. And if they want the truth, why don't they just lay it on the table, let the judges and the defense lawyers look at it, and then we can make intelligent and fair decisions to protect the people.
Clearly, the IG's report, which is due out next week, is not going to be the end of this matter. Congress is probably going to take a look at it as well. Martin Weinstein, you'll be staying with us in our next segment on Oklahoma City. And Marvin Miller, thank you for being with us tonight. Appreciate it. David Colapinto as well.
Thank you.
Right now,
You're
we're going to take a break, and up next, we'll bring you a live report.